Welcome back. Episode 109, Rob. DeFi by design. What's going on, guys? Got Matt here from Caldera. Rob, GM.
GM. Yeah, this is another pod today, episode 109. Pretty wild. We're on episode 109 because if you would have asked me 3 years ago, if DeFi was still going to be alive in 2-3 years, I don't know. Probably depend on the market conditions at the time.
I'd have said yes. The Ponzi must live on. No, I'm kidding. We'll just edit that part out. Matt, good to have you on.
Yeah, super great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Matt, we can get into it. We like to have fun, keep it conversational and casual on the podcast here, and then also talk about some high level concepts that can provide our audience some alpha. So let's talk about yourself first. Maybe that's a great place to start. So before we dive into Caldera, maybe you could tell us a bit about your background and how you got started in the space.
Totally. Yeah. So yeah, first of all, great to be here. My journey into the space, it actually happened quite a while ago. I was weirdly a crypto OG, though I don't have the net worth to show for it. So when I was in middle school, I was really active on online hacking forums and script kiddie, type of stuff, a little bit of just general software development. And from somewhere, on those forums, discovered Bitcoin at around 2011, 2012. I was 12 at the time. It was it was so different from now. I would be begging my mom to send money orders to Russia to let me buy Bitcoin. She obviously would not do that. But I eventually was able to earn some Bitcoin through online development work. And that was my first foray into the space. Ended up buying some Bitcoin when the first ATM opened up in my hometown, and then lost all of that Bitcoin in mt.Gox. That was my first full cycle crypto experience. Post that, kind of gave up on crypto for a little while, stuck with the software development, just doing a lot of miscellaneous work throughout high school. Ended up at Stanford where I studied computer science with a focus on distributed systems, operating systems, and a little bit of cryptography. And of course, when you're studying those three things, you kind of end up back in the crypto space. And so that's how, that's what eventually led to me kind of rejoining the space, meeting up with some cool people here, realizing a lot of the really cool things happening at the application layer, realizing that scaling is going to be needed to allow those applications to thrive. And then that's what led to us founding a scaling company in Caldera.
Nice. Yeah. Rob did his degrees in math and philosophy. And earlier today, we had a presentation on batch proofs as far as ZK provers go. And Rob was a happy guy. He was a happy man.
It felt good to be back in math class for a little bit. I was picking up on concepts that were probably beyond my understanding now, and maybe I could understand when I was taking those classes. So it's cool to see the concepts you learn about at such a an analytical, not just an analytical level, but you taken plenty of high level math classes, right? So you understand when someone asks when are we going to use this in real life? That never really goes away throughout your entire math curriculum, whether it's 8th grade algebra or it's university combinatorics. You're always kind of asking when are we going to use this in real life? So to see that math in ZK proofs actually written out by someone doing it by hand was really cool. To design a Merkle tree and set up some of these proofs was really cool to see in action. So we take a few different perspectives when it comes to looking at the crypto space. What is something that you're most interested in, whether it's, the problem that you're trying to solve, the scalability problem with Caldera, or generally where have you seen the most application of your education in cryptography and distributed systems? Where have you seen that most directly applied?
Yeah, I think in terms of my educational background, definitely kind of what we're working on right now, the scaling space. It's kind of funny because I would say rollups are in some sense the Web 2ification of Web 3, or harmonizing the lessons we've learned in Web 2 and applying them to Web 3. I mean, the whole point of a rollup is you're taking all this computation and storage and you're moving that all off chain, which means you're doing it in a Web 2 way for efficiency purposes. And then you're figuring out how under that paradigm to get the security benefits of Web3 and still transfer them onto those new processes. So definitely like what we're doing right now feels like a good combination of like the stuff I worked on at my previous roles, which were all like Web 2 or Web 2.5, and like what I studied in college and Web 3 things. In terms of like applications that I'm really excited about, I think we're finally seeing that scaling is no longer going to be the bottleneck for a lot of really great applications, thanks to the work that like we're doing and other folks in the modular blockchain space are doing. So like earlier today, I was actually just on a Twitter Spaces with some folks building in like the on-chain gaming sector. That's a sector I'm super bullish on. Basically, how do we put like entire video games all in smart contracts, all on chain, so that like they actually work in a completely decentralized manner where people are going to be able to like develop new clients and develop smart contracts on top of those games. And we're going to see games become a lot more like protocols versus like, monolithic pieces of software. And so enabling those types of use cases is also something I'm super excited about.
Yeah, our buddy from ZK Sync, Alex, our buddy, the co-founder of Matter Labs, he was saying that basically he thinks ZK and just general rollups, he's a little bit, very ZK focused, but I think optimistic as well. They just enable new innovation and application. And this, we've just been dreaming about this in 2020, even in 2017, like just when there was not much on chain during those two kind of adoption cycles, or however you want to call them. So yeah, we align with that at the Rollup, and frankly, we are super interested in like educating our community on these terms. Like I have decentralized sequencer maxi in my bio. Like, in what world is that English, Matt? So let's talk about the decentralization and the centralization of sequencers and kind of where we're at. So we had a podcast earlier with Matt Cutler from Block Native. He told us a lot about like kind of, different pros and cons to different designs in Ethereum. I'll just leave it at that because that one's great. You guys should all go watch that. But we got the sequencers, and basically we talked about the pros and cons of having a centralized sequencer and a decentralized one, and just what that means. So I know that was a lot, but what kind of is the trade-offs and the state of a rollup sequencer as we know it, and kind of where do you guys fit in there?
Yeah, so this is, of course, very topical because just last week, we announced the first optimistic rollup that is working with the decentralized sequencer network. We built that with Espresso, who's working on their own decentralized sequencer network. I think they're the best team in that space, but there are, of course, a bunch of others. So on the topic of like rollups today, every rollup today is centrally sequenced, which means that when you as a user send a transaction to that rollup, you send a transaction to like their server will order all the transactions, and that server will produce blocks and eventually submit those blocks to Ethereum mainnet or wherever the rollup is settling to. And so this generally works, and it's pretty secure. So like these rollups, they still, as long as they have like working proof systems, whether that's an optimistic proof scheme or a ZK proof scheme, like they can't steal funds. They can't, arbitrarily change the state of the rollup. They can't really act maliciously in most ways. And so that's why like we've been able to, with all the centrally sequenced rollups that we have right now, we've been able to still secure billions of dollars of value. That being said, when you are centrally sequenced, there are a few ways that sequencer can act maliciously. The first way is through censorship. So the rollup gets to decide then what transactions are included in which blocks and the ordering of those transactions. That means that sequencer can then theoretically prevent a certain user from submitting transactions to the chain. Oftentimes, a lot of the good rollup designs will have some way to bypass this, but that will often take, on the order of like a day or so, 24 hours, 12 hours, in order to force the inclusion of a transaction in the rollup. So like Arbitrum will do this. I think Optimism will do this. So there's a way to get around complete censorship, but decentrally sequenced rollups could theoretically delay your transactions and ruin your user experience if they wanted to censor you. The second thing with centralized sequencers is that you as the user don't have any visibility into the rollups mempool and how they're ordering transactions. And in fact, you can't. There's not really a way for them to prove that they're ordering transactions honestly, because you don't know like when those transactions are kind of actually coming into the sequencer via the network, right? You might have different latencies, et cetera. So the sequencer, the extent to which those teams can promise things are like, marketing and saying, oh, we promise to order these transactions fairly, but they themselves, even if those teams want to, and I think they do want to, can't prove that they're ordering transactions fairly. And so that means that there's a lot of MEV that those sequencers could extract if they wanted to. And so like some teams like Optimism actually had it in their original design. They would extract that MEV and return it to users and use it to fund public goods. I think they've since deviated from that position. But it is there's actually like a ton of MEV that those rollups can extract. And so that motivates the move into a decentralized sequencer, where instead of this mempool and all this ordering happening on a server in a centralized way, folks, just like how they would in like Ethereum or Polygon proof of stake, other, Bitcoin, other top networks, like they would just submit their transactions to these decentralized sequencer networks. And then they're able to have more faith that that network is ordering those transactions in a decentralized way. No single entity has control over the ordering of all the transactions on the network. And then the rollup node will then pull all that ordering from the decentralized sequencer network rather than being relied upon to order those transactions themselves. So you remove the fear of like censorship, and you also decrease the amount of MEV that the sequencer can extract from the chain.
Yeah, that's what Matt was saying, Rob. It was all about the MEV, because when it comes down to the economic viability of this situation in terms of security and profitability. Totally. And kind of MEV is very a dominant factor.
Yeah, totally. Because we saw that play out. Like we saw the MEV ecosystem flourish, and then all of a sudden people raced in to be part of that competition, and share in that economic value. And then we saw solutions come up. We saw MEV Boost, right, where that was an attempt to decentralize MEV a bit with auctions, I believe. And now we're increasingly seeing like more decentralization in those economic systems. And this brings me to the other narrative that we're seeing in lots of Twitter bios, which is modular systems. Because as we kind of like start to unpack the stacks of these rollups, like Ethereum made a transition from proof of work to proof of stake. And part of that came the separation of proposers and builders. And then with layer twos, we're starting to see almost like those come back together with the sequencers and the bundlers. Mm-hmm. And now we're starting to unpack those again by decentralizing sequencers from a centralized sequencer. So my question is, why is decentralization so important in this world of modular rollups and modular chains? Why is decentralized sequencers, how does that help to kind of like set up this decentralized network of chains and rollups so that we're not siphoning off economic value from one another, but we're more so taking part in this collective economic machine?
Totally. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it's really insightful to talk about like bundling and unbundling. People talk about that in like the Web2 startup space as well, right? Like you either make money by bundling services together or by unbundling services that were previously bundled. And I think in Web3, we do see like similar trends. So like, as you mentioned, like we did have a paradigm where where like sequencing was decentralized. We still do, right? Ethereum sequencing is decentralized. Then in the interest of efficiency and scaling, we moved to rollups right now, which are all centrally sequenced. And then now, of course, we're trying to go back the other way. And I think it's basically like trying to strike the balance where you move in the direction of performance first, and then you move in the performance of decentralization second, and then you end up at a later equilibrium. Then that's better on both fronts than what you had before. Specifically with regards to like the modular paradigm, I think decentralized sequencers are really important because this allows you to now plug in decentralization where you would have needed to previously build an entirely new network. So you could build a decentralized network using something like the Cosmos SDK. Now you need to recruit a bunch of validators to your chain. You need to incentivize them somehow. You need to make sure you have a token to incentivize those validators, which leads to inflation and maybe it limits your ability to design the protocol in the way that you want, limits your like business timelines, like you'll need to launch a token at the same time you launch the network. There are all these like undesirable properties of doing something in like such a tightly coupled way. Now you can just plug into an existing decentralized sequencer network like 𝗵𝗡 and maintain all of those benefits. I think there's also a bit of a secondary effect here that encourages decentralization, not at the network level, but at like the sort of like social or like society level, where previously the only teams that could have the most decentralized systems were like Ethereum, right? Or like the top chains. Those were the most decentralized. If you wanted to launch a chain, on Cosmos or something, that Cosmos chain will never be as decentralized or as legitimate as Ethereum. Now with like the modular stack, you're able to plug into that decentralized aspect of Ethereum or, in future, something like 𝗵𝗡 or both with our architecture. And that means that like if you're this new chain, it's a lot easier for you to convince other users and convince the community that you're aligned with those ecosystems and that you're sufficiently decentralized. Well, previously, that was really hard to do if you're trying to bootstrap your own network and prove to people that you're decentralized. And so we think for that reason, it's going to become a lot easier to start successful new chains. And so the total space, you can call it decentralization, you can call it maybe fragmentation, but we're going to end up in like a much more kind of multipolar decentralized world than we were before, just because we no longer have these like centralizing forces of trust at play.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, kind of it exponentially increases each choice that you make in favor of, just say like the good guys, which is just like choosing permissionless and trustlessness every day, and like having that ethos in your blood, and just kind of trying to build that, even if it means less profitability. Unfortunately, actually, it's definitely not a bad thing. It's a great thing that bases make. I think they made over $10 million in revenue last month from Friendtech. Like, in like what their second month live, they made 10 mil. What? So like the possibilities on the economic side are wild for the sequencers. But again, it's like that choice of kind of the ethos. But I don't want to get too deep into decentralized sequencing without talking about shared sequencing as well, which is kind of like the big key thing with 𝗵𝗡. Rob's got something though, so hold on one second.
I want to piggyback on the base conversation, because if we do like nudge systems in the direction of decentralization, and Base is currently bringing in $10 million a month in revenue per month with a centralized sequencer, what is the economic decision that they make to choose to keep the centralized or go decentralized? Is it just a matter of ethos versus like revenue that they're bringing in, or is there a scenario where they can continue to bring in close to $10 million in revenue each month, but open up to a decentralized sequencer? What is the trade-off of Base specifically making that decision?
Yeah. So on the technical level, there's these decisions are actually very, very separate. Like the fees that Base chooses to charge to users are completely separate from the fees that Base needs to pay to Ethereum or the integration of some shared sequencer network or distributed sequencer network. That ultimately is kind of set at like the protocol level, and Base will still have control over that protocol as the developers of it. And so Base could decide, tomorrow to like increase the fees. They could decide to decrease the fees. That on some level is like an arbitrary decision. So the only thing that like a decentralized sequencer network, like integrating with 𝗵𝗡 or similar will do is like it will force them to incur increased costs, because now they need to pay to have these transactions sequenced by that separate network. And typically, submitting transactions to a network has some costs associated with it in crypto, although hopefully like the scalability properties of all these networks will keep those costs low. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Base needs to change how they charge users, which is another really great thing about like the modular stack and this architecture, that a lot of these decisions are decoupled. I will say like Base, the way that a lot of these like OP stack chains make money is that they don't deviate too far away from the standard set by Optimism and to some extent Arbitrum, which is to charge a little bit of like extra buffer, to account for fee volatility on ETH-L1. And because they add that buffer in expectation, they tend to make money. And so that's why you'll see those graphs on like Dune Analytics of like all the rollup profits that all these sequencers make. And so I think the thing that will really motivate the decisions of these folks who are running large rollups is the extent to which the community cares about decentralization. If it turns out that the community does care a lot about decentralization, I think we're going to see new decentralized rollups really eat into the market share of these existing players and kind of force their hand. If that turns out not to be the case, then I think we'll see a little bit of inertia from them moving, to a decentralized sequencer network. But I think, as things have typically played out in the Web3 space, like typically there is some pressure to decentralize over time. And I think the same pattern will play out with rollups.
Yeah. To bring it to an analogy, like you had like the ETH killers versus ETH. Like obviously we hold ETH, like a lot of people do, so perhaps biased, but like these L1s that were more centralized, in my opinion, have ultimately a lot of them, 90% plus of them have lost to Ethereum, who has kept its mind on like, it's as if there's this organization of Ethereum has just kept its mind on that train of decentralization more so than, I don't even need to name one. There's tons, right? And so to that same regard, that decentralization provides pressure in the same sense that like when Arbitrum came out, I was more keen to deposit significant sums of capital into Arbitrum than I was to hold it on these other various L1s that were EVM compatible, but they had side chains, architecture, low validator counts, different kind of various pros and cons. You're just like, dude, at this point, like obviously this Arbitrum chain is centralized, but it's better than everything else. And to that extent, the same things is kind of going to happen here with the rollups, because from a user perspective, with good enough education, it makes more security sense to be in a place where there's more decentralization. There's usually more cost associated with that, or there sometimes has to be, or there's innovative ways to get around that, but that is usually true. So I agree with that point. And yeah, I still want to tie in. So to answer further on the base question, the changing to a decentralized sequencer, what does the current shared sequencer landscape look like from your lens? And are teams implementing them? Are teams implementing you guys? Frankly, what do you guys even do from a high level for everybody who we haven't got there too much yet? But like, can you tell everybody what you guys do as well? But I know that shared sequencing is something that you're going to want to touch on.
Yeah. So Caldera, we're the platform to launch modular blockchains and all the infrastructure those blockchains need. So we're kind of like a one-stop shop for folks who are thinking about deploying their own rollups, whether those are like application-specific rollups or ecosystem-specific rollups. They'll come to us, they'll log onto our platform, or they'll hop on a call with us. They'll tell us what they need on their rollup, and we'll help them launch a chain. And so in the Web3 space, there are a lot of really, really talented teams that don't have protocol developers or like distributed systems engineers or developer operations folks. And so it means like for like a lot of these teams that are looking to launch their own dedicated chain, they don't actually have a lot of the expertise in-house to do that. They're really focused on like smart contract development and developing a really great app and front end and user interface. And so we help abstract basically all the concerns that aren't those two things away from them, so they can focus on building their app without needing to get into the nitty gritty of like protocol engineering, in deploying their own rollup.
Yeah, that's sick. That's sorry to interrupt real quick. It's just a great business idea. We pivoted to the rollup like not last minute, but like 6-8 months ago. Similarly, just kind of like understanding the trend and then having like the DevOps. Yeah, it's sweet. And you guys then have a host of shared sequencers and sequencers that you allow these chains to come in, or these teams to come and build upon and then use.
Yeah, so we aim to be like the hub for all of this modular infrastructure. As I'm sure you guys know, as users of chains, like when you want to like onboard onto a chain, just having like a chain existing there is not like the only thing you need, right? You need developer tooling, you need bridging, you need common infrastructure, right? Like the graph, data providers, NFT marketplaces, right? DEXs, et cetera. And so we aggregate over basically all of the top teams in the space. We help those are the new chains that are deployed with us integrate with those teams. And so that, all the stuff I mentioned kind of exists above the stack that we operate on, right? Like graph indexers, marketplace, et cetera. But we also integrate with a lot of partners kind of below the stack or like at the level of the rollup stack. And like those two things are mostly DA and sequencing. So on the DA front, right now, most rollups that are built on Ethereum, they post data directly to Ethereum. As with anything on Ethereum, that is super, super expensive. Definitely good for certain use cases and really doesn't work for a lot of other use cases, especially high throughput ones like gaming and social. And so we allow the rollups that are built with us to launch with Celestia DA, for example. Eventually we'll integrate the other top providers like Eigen, maybe Avail, et cetera, to like radically reduce costs on their chain. And then of course we will also offer a litany of like shared sequencer options. So right now we have two options. You can use a centralized sequencer model, like the same model that Arbitrum, Optimism, ZK Sync, everybody else is using, or you can integrate with the Espresso sequencer. But eventually we want to offer integrations with every credible shared sequencer network. And we really see ourselves as like the top of funnel for a lot of these folks who are building lower in the stack than we are to like gain access to like all the developers who are actually looking to deploy their own rollups.
And you hit on the centralized and the decentralized sequencer models. Mm-hmm. So could you touch a bit more on the shared sequencer model, and then also like what are the ethical trade-offs and then the economic trade-offs for choosing a shared sequencer?
Yeah. So the way I think about this is like there are two axes on which to like talk about sequencers. There's centralized to decentralized, and then like shared, I guess, to like not shared. And so typically there's like a bit of a conflation between these two terms, but they do technically mean different things. So a shared sequencer is it means at the base level that like the sequencer you're using is also being used by other rollups and other chains. And so something like like Espresso is both decentralized and shared, but you could have, and some people are definitely working on this, like centralized but shared sequencers where you're still centralized, you're still sequencing the chains in a centralized way, but you're sequencing multiple different chains in that centralized way.
Can I interrupt with kind of like a comment, but also a question? Like that dynamic, that architecture sounds the most economically sound. The centralized and shared model sounds like I can centralize my operations, keep costs low, and then I can also provide this for multiple different networks at once because it's shared, and again split costs even further. Is that kind of like a accurate mental
leaves
model
you with the surplus too, Rob?
These shared
leaves you with cash and others.
A centralized.
Yeah.
No, that's okay.
Like,
so
like I think you're right. No, I mean, yeah, Matt.
I think you're correct. So yeah, you do get to split the costs of like multiple chains all into one sequencer. Another benefit you get is interoperability, where like now that when all these chains are sequenced by the same sequencer, you do get some interoperability benefits. It makes it easier to do atomic swaps across chains, et cetera. Because one way to kind of model it out is like once you have a completely shared sequencer between multiple chains, there's actually very little difference between that on a technical level and treating all of those distinct chains as kind of like one chain. And so you get like big benefits of like atomicity between those chains as well. So yeah, a lot of really nice properties. And I think you're correct that like if you're going at this from a pure economic standpoint, like you get all the interop benefits by doing it that way, and you don't need to deal with the costs of running a decentralized network or plugging into a decentralized network as you would with decentralized sequencing. And
what do you do with the surplus? What are all these rollups doing with the surplus? Of like, what is Base doing with this? Who knows? Is that to be distributed to token holders, to team, to DAO? Like, and with Caldera, I guess what's the economic model for the surplus left over after? And for those who are a little bit new to like the DA side of things, DA is like some of the most expensive operation, as you're saying, Matt. So you've got the user fees minus basically DA costs, and then you get money left over.
Yeah, I think the great thing about rollups is that it's up to each individual chain to decide what they do with that surplus. So there will be chains that just treat it as profit. There will be chains that use it to fund some grants program. There will be chains that try to minimize it. Right now, like very few rollups are trying to minimize it, but they basically can decide to, right? Set a target of like $0 profit. And then there are going to be chains that try to find some novel mechanism to redistribute these funds, right? Or maybe they'll like stake it and use it as like an endowment for the chain to ensure that the chain can be continually operated and provide stronger guarantees for their users over long periods of time. I think right now there's very little focus on this. I think people have just started really talking about the surplus within the last 3 to 6 months. As you mentioned, part of it I think motivated by 𝗵𝗏𝗃's major success on base. But because there's now a ton of interest in just like what gets done with these like massive piles of money, I think we're going to see a lot of innovation more on like the business side and the economic side of just like how those funds end up being used. And it will be just like one of, many other ways that rollups differentiate from each other.
Public goods, man. I'm sure a lot of them are going to use public goods.
Totally.
Use it. It's like a business. It makes me smile because it's still a self-fulfilling prophecy of a business, if you think about it in a sense. However, with innovation, more real use cases, more real users, quote unquote, and bigger communities, I mean, rollups are a business model in a sense. And so like that's a big step for crypto. And for like this entire industry to think about things like, oh, we have a surplus. And I think, yeah, it's going to be a cool differentiating factor to see public goods or who's more capitalistic and profit taking, just kind of gets rich off creating a roll up, or kind of who does like, and then I'm sure there's going to be interesting roll up stories of people doing bad things or good. Like it's just going to be interesting. You can see it developing right now. There's a couple dozen roll ups right now, maybe I think probably maybe less, but probably I'd say a couple dozen. Dude, in 6 to 12 months, there's going to be like 1,500 or 1,000. They're going to be like, what just happened? So yeah, this is going to be very interesting to see what happens. Yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you had a really good point there as well, with just like, this being kind of like a new form of business model. It's actually one of the biggest reasons we're seeing projects come to us and want to deploy a rollup is like, it's really rare in crypto to find like defensible, sustainable business models. Almost everyone relies on Ponzi-nomics or like inflation, just like something that just like can't be sustained over time. The rollup business model is actually really, really clean. It's effectively just like a usage-based pricing model, right? You're taking a percentage of transaction fees. You're taking it's like a cost plus model, right, for the application. And so we're seeing, I think a lot of applications, take 𝗵𝗏𝗃, for example, right? Like they will probably in the future maybe move to their own chain because they'll be able to internalize a lot of that revenue, and their users are going to want them to internalize that revenue and allow that to fund development. And so it's another reason why I think we're going to see, as you said, like 1,500, tens of thousands, millions of rollups in the near future.
Yeah, I think that unlocks this new narrative we're seeing play out as well, which is app chains, right? Which is like I think you make a great point about like the consideration that 𝗵𝗏𝗃 is probably thinking about. Where, well, what if we do launch our own app chain? Why should we, or why should we not? And kind of like it would be fun to play out kind of that hypothetical situation of like, we're in this boardroom roundtable conversation where the 3 C-suite executives of 𝗵𝗏𝗃, and we're choosing whether or not to launch an app chain. Like, do we launch it, with our own sequencer? Do we outsource it to Espresso and Caldera so that we operate at like a zero cost basis? We're able to get high scale at relatively no cost, and then just recoup the 𝗵𝗏𝗃 fees and redistribute those 𝗵𝗏𝗃 fees right to our 𝗵𝗏𝗃 users and to our friends. Like what are some of the considerations that higher up at 𝗵𝗏𝗃 might be thinking about when they're considering these moves?
Yeah, the biggest trade-off that everyone needs to think about when they're deciding whether to launch on a general purpose chain or to launch an app chain or an app rollup, is whether they get more out of the network effects of launching on some general purpose chain, or like, do they get more from those network effects, or will they eventually profit more or get more freedom from launching their own chain? And of course, in the life cycle of every successful project, there will be a time when like that project crosses the threshold. When you're early and you're new and you're completely unproven, right? Like Friendtech got a lot as a new project from launching on Base. There's a ton of liquidity there. Users already had funds on that chain. Like they, it allowed them to grow super quickly to just have a captive audience of folks who are looking to try new applications on Base. But eventually, like we've seen what that costed them, right? If they're able to replicate that user growth on their own chain, it would have been a little bit more painful, maybe a little bit more friction, but it costed them, $10 million, right? And those costs are going to increase. So the biggest thing that I think those teams need to think about, every team, it'll be a little bit different. There are going to be protocols like, Uniswap, where like they get a ton of benefit from being on a general purpose chain where like they interoperate with all these other protocols and are very tightly integrated with other applications. Where those network effects are really strong. There are other things like games where those network effects I think are pretty weak. Maybe the NFTs will go onto OpenSea or something, but they don't need a ton of interoperability with the rest of the network. And so there's that consideration, and there's also like the profit side of things. How much money can you make by launching your own chain? And we've actually, for a lot of the folks we talk to, when trying to sell them, like we'll do this calculation with teams, and a lot of teams like they don't realize how much money they could be making if they launch their protocol as an app chain. You think about all the amount of money folks are spending on Optimism, Arbitrum, mainnet Ethereum. Like even if you're able to capture a small piece of that, it gets really substantial very quickly.
Yeah, when the Rollup chain, the Rollup media education, good vibes chain.
Totally. Yeah. You guys should seriously think about it.
We are working on a Rollup stack for now, but that is under wraps.
Got it.
Let's say we were going to let's say we said, yeah, like the Rollup chain. And what, kind of sitting in between a lot of these intersecting technologies, like what do you suggest for, in this case, the Rollup or any other project that's launching their own network and their own chain? Like what do you suggest as far as like a first pass, or like just generally curious, like as far as the considerations and then the steps to launch your own chain?
Yeah, so we definitely recommend teams that are thinking about this to talk to a provider like us. We've done a ton of work in like evaluating different rollup stacks, and like figuring out the most efficient way, the most cost-effective way, the most secure and reliable way to run those rollup stacks. And we abstract away, as I said, like basically needing to, like if you guys were trying to launch your own chain, you would need to hire like a DevOps team, a protocol engineering team, potentially like a front end team to work on things. Like we abstract away needing to hire like 3 different teams from the folks who are thinking about launching a rollup. So generally, like in the abstract, I think it makes sense to go with an infrastructure provider like us or one of our competitors, I guess, in order to like think through these decisions, just because we've found that we've taken like time to market from, what could potentially be years down to like weeks to months. In terms of like the actual like base layer rollup stack, we think in general, like the existing rollup stacks today, they cover most use cases really well. And I think for a lot of the folks who are looking to launch their own chain, they're not looking to make like protocol level innovation. They're looking to make like social or like business or app level innovation. And so for those folks, I would say go with like a tried and true stack, OP stack, the Arbitrum stack, potentially some of the new like ZK EVM stacks, like ZK Sync, Polygon ZK EVM. Like those are all relatively easy to come to an infrastructure provider like us and ask us to deploy. And those are going to like cover, 95% of use cases really, really well. And then between those stacks, it comes down to like specific features, which community you feel more aligned with, ZK versus optimistic, kind of cost profile you want the chain to have. There are like a lot of micro decisions, but at a macro level, just like it always makes sense to go with the most reliable software.
So cool. So cool. No wonder there's going to be 10,000 rollups. You've just closed Rob and I on 3-minute conversation. No, I'm just messing around, but yeah, very, very interesting thought process to be having from a DApp perspective, especially if you start to look at things from just from the economic business cost and liquidity/composability needs perspective. It's like, do you really need to be in a general purpose execution environment? Like, are you sure? But very, very cool stuff. I know that you mentioned what's happening with the Espresso team, and I just wanted to briefly touch on that update one last time here. So you guys are working on an optimistic decentralized shared sequencer set. So fill us in on kind of like how that looks. Like, you and Espresso are partners in a sense, or are collaborators in this model of where you use their shared sequencers in your stack of deliverables. Kind of what is going on with Espresso? What's this announcement? Yeah, like, how does that kind of look?
Yeah, so Espresso, their bread and butter is this shared sequencer network. So they've built out all the software for the network itself, and that network acts as the sequencer for transactions. So users can submit transactions to that network. That network will order those transactions, basically package them up into blocks, and that ordering will be considered the canonical ordering of the Rollup chain. And so that's a network that completely handles that piece of the modular puzzle. That being said, that is just a piece of the puzzle, and the biggest unlock for a network like that is to get integrated with the popular rollup stacks I mentioned, so that I guess not even users necessarily, but developers and the people who are launching new rollups can easily plug into that network. And that's where we come in that collaboration. We helped Espresso integrate that their infrastructure, their shared sequencer network, into the OP stack. So now we have a really tight integration with the OP stack there. And we also hosted a testnet for that OP stack on our infrastructure. And so we're enabling users now to go check out that testnet, request funds from the faucet, submit a transaction, and that transaction will now go to the Espresso sequencer, will be sequenced by them, and then will come to the OP stack node for final submission and processing. And so that collaboration, we're handling a lot of some of the software implementation and the infrastructure on the Rollup node, and they're managing the software development and the infrastructure on the separate shared sequencer network that the node is plugging into.
And do they have anything live on mainnet? Sorry.
Yeah, they do not. They're currently in testnet mode.
So early.
We
are so early to the rollup wars. It feels like early DeFi days, and it's just hitting me so hard on this pod right now. Oh man.
I have a bunch more questions, and I know we're coming up on somewhat of time, so I'm going to save my decentralized sequencer question for perhaps a conversation with Espresso about how to actually participate in those sequencings and earn as a result. So I guess the question I would like to ask is you helped Espresso integrate into the OP stack so that when new rollups deploy using the OP stack, they utilize this shared Espresso sequencer. So is there a difference between using the Caldera stack, or if I was to use the OP stack and I would get Espresso as a part of that, and let's say let's say you have a future partnership with Celestia or Eigenlayer, and you help integrate those data availability solutions into the OP stack. Does coming to the OP stack, given that I have access to Espresso and Celestia, kind of give me access to everything I might need in terms of infrastructure? Or what else is out there that Caldera can loop into the equation?
Yeah. So Caldera, we are mostly focused on hosting these existent stacks. That means we do a lot of protocol development on those stacks. That includes, what you mentioned, the Celestia integration, the Espresso integration. We did that in collaboration with those teams. It also includes a lot of other things, just nice improvements for reliability, for security, for making it easier to deploy these stacks in the cloud. I would say if there is to be anything like a Caldera stack, what I would define most of our proprietary work being as increasing the customizability of these rollup stacks that exist. So previously, it would be pretty difficult if you wanted to, let's say, do a network with all these, let's say, custom precompiles and a custom gas token and using Celestia for DA. We have created interfaces that allow those customization points to be really quick, where they're effectively just like toggles rather than you needing to do a ton of work on the back end. Plus, just these additional integrations with other infrastructure providers. We're not focused on building our own proprietary stack. That is super capital intensive, takes a really long time, and there are all these amazing teams that have done this really well for us already. So all of our work is mostly on the infrastructure and customizability side.
And like we started this podcast, you can do a lot of good business by bundling up these pre-existing good infrastructure. You're either a bundler or an unbundler, and Caldera bundles together some of the best Web3 infrastructure available.
Totally.
100%. Matt, I think we could go on for hours, but the good news is the DeFi world will just provide us with another thing to talk about in less than a week or 2 or 3, and then there's another big announcement, and then there's more to go on. But to summarize here for all of our listeners and just everybody who's interested in rollups, there's definitely pros and cons for centralized and decentralized sequencers. Using Caldera to jumpstart your own chain experience definitely seems to be a conversation willing to be had, right, Matt? And the technology with the shared sequencers, Espresso coming on live on mainnet soon, hopefully testnet now. The absolute cusp of this world that we're about to embark on in 2024 with rollups this is going to be awesome. And yeah, I just want to say thanks, Matt, again for coming on. And Rob, any closing thoughts?
It's been a pleasure, Matt. I'll kick it over to you. Any closing thoughts or anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo Andy's enthusiasm. It's palpable, and we feel the exact same thing. Super early days, but I think we're at the point where we figured out how to do a lot of the table stakes things. We know how to run rollups. There are all these folks who have built really great software in this space, and now we're just waiting for the Cambrian explosion to happen of all this new innovation and all these new chains. If I could shill Caldera a little bit, would encourage everyone to check out our website, 𝗠𝗠𝗏𝑥𝑦𝑧, or our Twitter @𝗠𝗠𝗏𝑥𝑦𝑧, especially for teams or developers who are looking to launch their own chain. We'd love to speak with them. I think the folks who we've worked with have found us to, at the very least, be genuinely quite helpful in helping them think through stacks and think through these technical architecture decisions, whether they end up launching a rollup or not. So we'd love to chat with builders. If any of them are listening, please get in touch.
Thanks for coming on, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, guys. See ya.
Thanks.